You know, context is everything, isn't it? And when you read the Bible, you need to pay attention to the context in which it was written, for anything we might know about that time, and the context in which we are reading it, and also everything that happened from then until now. It's a lot of context. So, for example, we get that description of the stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts, one of the early things in the history of the church. But it doesn't tell you about the 2 chapters before that in which Stephen basically lectured and yelled at the temple officials and the religious officials, telling them all of what happened in the Old Testament of the promise of the Messiah. And then he says, "You killed the Messiah." Then he says, "I see the heavens opening and the Son of God, the Son sitting at the right hand of the Father." Well, it was the 2 chapters before that that got him stoned, not him saying, "I have a vision of God." See, context is everything. The same thing when we look at the Gospel of John. I'm sure all of you can quote the phrases, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," right? But what's important to know is what was going on when John was writing that gospel. As you can see from the story of Stephen, starting with the crucifixion of Jesus, Christians were being persecuted. They were being martyred. They were being stoned and crucified. And although the Bible tells you about that happening at the hands of Jewish officials, it was most likely happening at the hands of Roman officials, because the Roman emperors, Diocletian and Nero being 2 of the more famous ones, were ordering the killing, the execution of Christians unless they agreed to worship the Roman emperor. And a lot of Christians refused to admit to that, to agree to worshiping the Roman emperor. So martyrdom was very common in the early church, very common. And when John was writing this, if this is John of Patmos, then it's a man in exile writing to us as well. So a man who has suffered terribly at the hands of people who are telling him, "Get out." So he writes in a tone that sounds very exclusive to us, saying, "Do not worry, don't let your hearts be troubled. You are going to be protected by Christ because of your faith. Not necessarily protected from injury or jail or death, but protected from everlasting death. You will be protected in the sense that you will be at home forever with God." There's a promise made to those who believe in Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. And that promise remains true to this day. The differences between then and now in terms of interpretation is that if you read what theologians and biblical scholars say about this passage today, they will say this passage is not saying that every other person in the world except Christians is unholy and destined to everlasting death. It does not say that. It's merely saying if you've been called to follow Jesus, keep following Jesus. Don't run away out of fear. Don't believe that God has abandoned you when bad things happen to you. Simply stay on the way, and you will be taken care of. And the reason we have changed our interpretations is partly because Christians went astray in history. Think of the Crusades, killing people of other religions, or the Holocaust, killing people of other religions. We now recognize that the proclamation of the gospel and that following Jesus do not require us to believe that people of no faith or other faiths are less better than we are, or that they should be eliminated in any way. On the contrary, that is rarely how we proclaim the gospel. I find it very interesting that the last 3 rectors of this church, from Wayne Sanders through Christopher Chase and now me, have all been people who have had deep interfaith relationships, have encouraged interfaith understanding and relationships. It is rare that somebody says, at least in the Episcopal Church, that somebody says, unless your Jewish friend or Muslim friend or atheist friend converts, they are doomed, right? That's not how we proclaim the gospel in this day. And in fact, we know that the most effective proclamation of the gospel is to live as much as we can the way Jesus lived and to teach as much as we can the way he taught. Jesus did speak in generous, loving ways to people of other faiths. Think of the Gerasenes, think of the Samaritans that he spoke to. He spoke in loving, accepting ways of them. Even the great Hindu religious leader Gandhi said, if Christians act like Jesus, I'd be a Christian. He actually said that. If Christians act like Jesus, I would be a Christian. So, what does it mean to follow Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life? How do we actually do that in our time and place? Most of us do not expect to be martyred in our part of the world. In other parts of the world, perhaps yes. It might be dangerous to be Christian right now. It is dangerous to be Christian in other parts of the world. But in this part of the world, usually you don't consider it to be dangerous to be a Christian. And yet, the church that I used to work for, All Saints Pasadena, has armed security guards in front of it today in the Pasadena Police Department because they received 2 threats. One threat earlier this week was, we're going to plant a bomb at your church and blow it up in the middle of services. And the second one is, I'm going to come in with an automatic rifle and I'm going to shoot down your rector. And they decided to go ahead with services. They alerted the whole congregation. They said, if you want to stay home, we understand, but we're going to be worshiping. And why are they receiving this death threat? Because they have a reputation as being a quote-unquote gay church. Well, hopefully any church that is an Episcopal church would be identified as the gay church. That is a church that openly welcomes people who are LGBTQ, that invites them into leadership, that considers them equal children of God. That is why they are suffering a threat. Another church in our diocese has won a $200,000 grant from FEMA because FEMA wants to make churches secure. So they're going to build walls around their church and the camera system. They're all going to get training. They're going to be as safe as they can be worshiping. And so one of our church members said to me, you know, I've been doing research, and if a shooter did come to church, you'd be the most likely person to be killed. And I thought, you know what? If this is how I meet my end, singing praises to God, remembering the gifts of Jesus, dying in this, frankly, it's the best way to go. I don't want to go now, no. But I'm saying, if I had to, this would be good. You know what I'm saying? And it'd probably be quick too. So it can be dangerous at times to be a Christian. It can be at times. What's more likely is that if you are actually following Jesus, there are going to be times when you offend others. And so I ask myself, have I offended anybody by being Christian? Because if I've been living so carefully around all my neighbors that I never offend anybody, then I'm probably not following Jesus as closely as I think I am. It can be very subtle. People are gossiping around you, and you realize, I shouldn't be in this conversation, and so you change the conversation or walk away. You lose friends because you won't get into the backstabbing conversation at work, or you lose the promotion at work because you won't follow along with your boss's backstabbing ways. It happens, right? Happened in seminary. It happens all the time. You can lose friends, you can lose promotions, you can lose a raise because you wouldn't go along with the prevailing wind that you sensed was not Christian. Am I right? You suffer as a Christian. And I ask myself, have I suffered recently as a Christian? Because if I haven't, I wonder if I've been once again kowtowing to whatever the cultural pressures are of the day. So to be going along with my neighbors. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. And so I actually measure, to what degree have I noticed losing out on something? Now, there are various ways to suffer. Let's say you want to buy something just because you want to buy something, it's pretty. And yet you recognize that you could also give that money to charity, and you're like, yeah, but I want the pretty thing. And yet you decide to give it to charity instead, and you suffer a little bit. You recognize that you aren't welcome at the table of a certain friend or relative anymore because you go to the gay church. That's suffering. But the more likely suffering is the suffering I mentioned last week from the teaching of Thomas Merton. He says that the greatest stumbling block to us, the greatest source of suffering to us, is ourselves. That is the most likely thing. That the most likely thing to keep me from the way and the true and the life of Jesus is to give in to me. So, for example, when somebody annoys me, I just sit there and I just chew on that resentment and think, in the shower, I think about what I would have said. If I give in to that instead of saying, oh, knock it off, Janine, let it go down the drain, I'm a stumbling block. Do you see what I mean? That's what Thomas Merton's talking about. The wanting to be thought well of, the wanting to be important or relevant, that these are the things that actually get in the way of our following Jesus on the way. One of the interesting things that I noticed, I was watching a news, reel of the coronation of King Charles III, and he was not only crowned as the king, but he was also named as the head of the Church of England. He is the religious leader of the Church of England. And he had an interfaith thing going. As you know, he's always cared about other faiths. And he did have religious leaders of a variety of faiths and other Christian denominations there to make sure that everybody knew that he was very open-minded. And though it is an Anglican country, that he was going to be very open-minded. But as we had a religious commentator, religious expert talking about him as the head of Church of England and the interfaith aspect of the day, and then they said, the church is becoming less and less relevant. And I felt that pang for a second, as a Christian, but also as a professional who wants the church to keep going. I felt the pang, and then wait a minute. Do I want to be relevant? I mean, what does it mean to be relevant, to be talked about all the time, to be in the news all the time, to be considered important? Do I want the church to be considered relevant? And I certainly do want it to be known about. But what they're talking about is the church being the source of power and control in society. So I thought, if we worry about being relevant, if we worry about people thinking well of us, will that keep us on the way? Or will acting like Jesus in everything we do actually be the thing that steers the church back into view as something that is a saving power in people's lives? Do you see the difference? Being considered important versus actually acting like Jesus. He was not considered important. He was not considered relevant. They said, let's get rid of this rabble-rouser and we'll be done with the problem. They blew it, right? It didn't work because he lived such a self-giving, self-denying style of life that they didn't see him coming because they thought important people act like important people. He didn't act like an important person. He actually was the most important person ever to live. That's what it is to follow the way, the truth, and the life. To embrace the Spirit as it is working and living in our time, to act as much like him as we can, to get ourselves out of the way as being really good at being Christian or important for being Christian, and to simply let God do his work through us. Amen.